Welcome. My name is Vince Furpo. I am the Vice President for Public Engagement at the Newberry. Thank you for being here this evening for our Meet the Author event, both to all those of you here in the room with us and those joining us virtually, potentially from home. We are so thrilled to welcome all of you to the Newberry. Since our founding in 1887, yes, we've been around for a very long time, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world. Now a premier center for humanities scholarship and a global destination for both in-person and online learning, we connect researchers and visitors just like you with our collection of books, maps, and manuscripts in our reading rooms, exhibition galleries, classrooms, online digital resources, and programming spaces just like this one. And just like tonight's program, our reading rooms and our exhibitions galleries are open to you at no charge. In fact, I would absolutely encourage you to visit our exhibition spaces after the program to see pop-up books through the ages. And while you're in there, you might want to grab your very own, build your own pop-up Newberry library. I look forward to seeing your completed ones on social media. At the conclusion of tonight's talk, we will convene a question and answer session. We ask that you text your questions to the numbers on the screen. The number is 833-899-3399. This is for those of you in the room as well as those of you joining us virtually, and that number will continue to display on the screen throughout the talk, so you don't need to write it down right now. Just a reminder, we do have a listening assistance system here in the room. If you need to use that or need any help, please visit our table over here and we can help you with that. As I mentioned, programs like this, our reading rooms, our galleries are all open to you free of charge. Thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. We do invite you to make a gift. If you're interested in doing so, you can visit us online, or we have some QR codes over at the table. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Simon Balto is a scholar, writer, and teacher of history and African American studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of the multi-award winning Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power. Heather Hendershot, professor of film and media at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is author of What's Fair on the Air? Cold War Right-Wing Broadcasting and the Public Interest, and Open to Debate, How William F. Buckley Put Liberal America on the Firing Line. Her latest book, which she will discuss with you all tonight, is titled When the News Broke, Chicago 1968 and the Polarizing of America. The book was recently named the shortlist recipient of the 2023 Pattis Family Foundation Chicago Book Award at the Newberry Library. Please join me in welcoming Heather and Simon.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming, and I want to do a special shout out to the Newberry Library. I did research a lot of different places for this book, and this was one of my very favorite places to do work. It was quite wonderful. I'm going to start out by showing you some slides just to kind of get your head back in 1968 and give you a sense of what's in the book, and also a few images. It's kind of a treat to show people some of the images that I wasn't able to include in the book, so you get some bonus features here. Just as I'll start out with a spoiler and just say, here's what I argue in the book. Before the Chicago Convention in August 1968, the notion that the mainstream media had a kind of liberal bias that was fatally flawed with liberal bias was an extremist point of view and a regional point of view. That is to say, if you identified as a right-winger, someone like, say, William F. Buckley, or even farther right than him, you assumed that the media had a liberal bias. And if you were in the South or elsewhere as a segregationist and you didn't like the way the mainstream media covered the civil rights movement, you had this complaint that there was liberal media bias. But most people understood the media, the mainstream media, television, newspapers, as really trying to be very fair and balanced. To use that later phrase from Fox News, to be as fair and objective as possible, and that these were neutral professionals and they were trained to be objective, if at all possible, and to be neutral and to be fair. And that notion shifted quite radically for a number of reasons after the convention. Um, the convention is famous for a number of key images, in particular the Battle of Michigan Avenue, the third night of the convention, when 10,000 protesters were beaten in the street by police as they chanted, "The whole world is watching." And what I tried to do with the book was to get beyond the few sort of memories we have of this event and broaden our understanding of it, and to get at these liberal media bias issues I was just talking about, but also to get at the key racial issues, issues about social justice and voting rights that were going on inside the amphitheater. So I look at the streets, but I also look at what was going on inside. Of course, journalists in particular were being targeted. News people at the time didn't like to be the story. They wanted to tell the story, and they were at times forced to become part of the story because there was so much violence against them in the street. Whether, you know, if you picked up a camera, you were likely to have that camera broken by a Chicago police officer. Of course, the protesters against Vietnam and against the Democratic Party were famously beaten in the street, and then were taken into McCarthy campaign headquarters for kind of emergency medical care. And then they ended up watching what had happened in them 3 hours earlier on television. So really, the truer thing than "the whole world is watching" would have been a very awkward, the whole world will be watching 3 hours from now, because there was no capability for live news imagery from the street in front of the Chicago Hilton Hotel. Um, I look at a number of important characters, whether people on the floor of the convention or the news people, and of course Huntley and Brinkley were seen as very trustworthy characters by most TV viewers, as was Walter Cronkite, who was, his nickname is the most trusted man in America. He was kind of beloved, and even he had gone to Vietnam and said that we were mired in a stalemate in Vietnam, and he wasn't attacked for that. And in fact, the reason in part was that the country's opinion was already turning against the war, even as he went in 1968 during and towards the end of the Tet Offensive. This is a image that's not in the book, but going in the archive of his papers in Texas, you see tokens of how much people really loved him, and they sent him. This is a picture of a baby watching the Democratic convention. People love to send pictures of their pets. This is Cronkite, the kitten. A young girl named, a 6-year-old named her kitten Cronkite, and then sent him the photo. And I love this photo. Looks like a Sears Roebuck setting, the sort of satin in the back. And he wrote her a very nice note back and said how honored he was that she had named her kitten after him. Okay, so I said specifically that I went inside the amphitheater to see what was going on. There's a lot of chaos on the floor of the convention, and these are pro-peace delegates. And if you look carefully, you can see that the signs they're holding up have fold lines in them. They had to smuggle them into the convention. They're printed on newsprint. So, basically they're holding up the Chicago Tribune, and they printed posters on top of that secretly, folded it up in their clothing, and snuck it into the convention hall, because Mayor Daley would only let you come in with pro-Humphrey material, or pro-LBJ material even, but certainly not with pro-peace material. One of the famous moments from the convention that is remembered, like the Battle of Michigan Avenue, is Dan Rather being punched by Daley's thugs, and I put thugs in quotation marks because that was a line from Cronkite that's been sort of immortalized, that he actually lost his cool and lost his neutrality for a moment when his reporter was slugged. But I think, we need to retell that story, that it's not just about him being punched, which was a serious thing, but he was being punched in a sort of scrum around the Georgia delegation, and he was being punched in the midst of a debate from angry delegates who have been basically white supremacy in Georgia was being challenged. And that's why tempers were flaring at this particular moment when he was punched. It had to do with a racial crisis happening during the convention. Bond was protesting the Georgia delegation chosen by Lester Maddox. This is his LP. If I go to jail, just to give you a sense of his classy style. He's a sort of George Wallace Monkey of that moment, but you know, Georgia instead of Alabama. Fannie Lou Hamer is an important, that kind of has a bit part in the 68 convention, and of course she was very crucial in the 1964 convention, which I could talk about during Q&A if you would like. Afterwards, Daley kept this event in the news, in effect helping LBJ, or rather helping Humphrey to lose the election, although that was not his intent, but he kept the memory and the sort of hostility around what had happened with the police and the protesters alive. Then Nixon just weaponized this liberal media bias idea, and he opened his campaign in Chicago with this ticker tape parade, as if to say, well, I can make people happy and joyous in the streets of Chicago if Mayor Daley and the Democratic Party cannot. It was a real uh, blow to open uh, uh, in Chicago. And then, of course, during his campaign, the Chicago events became part of his whole larger rhetoric around the idea of law and order. I just want to close out with one final image. This is a T-shirt from the 1996, the last time that the Democratic National Convention was held here, and the police, somebody, there, nobody said, I'm the one, you know, but made a bunch of these T-shirts and sold a lot of them. And it says, "We kicked your father's ass. Now it's your turn." So it's a weird, disturbing moment of a certain memory of what happened in 1968. And we'll see how much 1968 comes up as we head into the next Democratic Convention here in 2024. So I will stop there and hand things over to Simon. Thank you so much, Simon, for being here, by the way.
Of course. Thank you, Heather. So I have so many questions just about that last image that I would love to try to unpack. But maybe we can, discuss that later. So I have the privilege of just sort of being a bit of a moderator for this. Moderator is the wrong word, but I have some questions for Heather that I'm hoping that she just takes and runs with. I don't consider my role here to be a lot of speechifying. I will just say that this book rules. It's really, really, it's smart. It's very compelling. It's very convincing. It's really funny. It's one of those books that you feel like one of your good friends is just telling you an absolutely riveting story, coupled with smart analysis and some sort of jokes inside. So please do pick it up. But just as a kind of a big question, I suppose, to get us started, and this maybe is just an invitation to talk a bit more about what you just discussed, but I mean, so much has been written about 68, Chicago, and I'm just, for people are here for a particular reason, right? I mean, it has like a real historical resonance. And so I'm just wondering if, like, against the backdrop of all that's been written about Chicago 68, if you would like to just say a bit more about what you think your book does to kind of help us better understand that horrible 4 days here in Chicago. And also just as like, it's a question within the question, but just what is it that led you to write this book, right? Knowing what we do know about the fact that people have written about Chicago 68. So there's kind of two different things going there, but why this book and what does it teach us that we didn't previously know?
Yeah, thanks. There are a lot of books about 1968 in general, not just in the US, but as a global moment, right? And about Chicago specifically, there's a handful of key books. One, of course, is there's a book about that focuses on the Chicago police and what happened then, and it's based on interviews done about 20 years later. There's the book by David Farber called Chicago 68 that does get into some of the convention floor, some of the inside stuff, not just the outside stuff, as I was talking about. And that's a very useful book that is very strong. And then, of course, there's a famous book by Todd Gitlin called The Whole World is Watching. And that's an adaptation of his PhD thesis about news coverage of the New Left and SDS. of which he was a key member, Students for a Democratic Society. And when you hear, oh, his book is called The Whole World is Watching, you're, this is going to be completely about the Democratic Convention. It's actually not. There's some important stuff there about the convention. But he's looking at how the news media framed the New Left as a news issue and didn't really get into the issues that they were talking about. So if they had a protest and it was about, draft dodging, the coverage would be, well, they blocked the street, we're worried about violence. They tend to frame things as spectacle, and the problem was the protesters. And they never were like, well, the problem is Vietnam, or what's happening with the Tet Offensive that they're reacting to. So it's a very good book, but it doesn't really, even as it's about the media, it doesn't get you like diving into what the media was doing in Chicago. And part of that is that he was resistant to the Yippies were a big force in Chicago. There are a lot of different groups in Chicago, but the Yippies were key. And Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin were very theatrical. These are people who, like, they're on trial and they show up dressed as Santa Claus or as an American revolutionary. They bring a pig to Chicago in August to be nominated for president, Pegasus. And initially, Abby Hoffman picks a pig that's pretty cute because it's a baby pig, and Jerry Rubin's like, no, you gotta have an ugly pig. It's gonna get better media coverage, And so they are really into these sort of gags, and for someone like Gitlin, it's like, what are your policy objectives? They're not serious enough. And so I think that's part of his reluctance to go into some of the stuff happening in Chicago, because he felt like people were like pulling the cameras through spectacle rather than political discourse sometimes. So the way that I ended up writing this book is I was at the Paley Center for Media doing some research on Governor Lester Maddox. And he had been at the Chicago Convention with the Georgia delegation. And after Julian Bond, the challenger that you saw that image of, gained some traction, and his people were seated along with the delegates that Maddox brought. Maddox left. He left his own delegation. He was the governor. He went home, and he staged a press conference at a ballroom and to announce that he was leaving, and also that he would no longer be running for president. And the CBS cut to that, showed him at the podium, and then the camera pulled back, and we saw that he was speaking to an empty ballroom. There were maybe 3 or 4 people with cameras. There were a couple of journalists with little notepads. There were people there covering this as a news event. But if they hadn't pulled the camera back, he would have looked like he was he's at a big podium in a ballroom, right? So I thought, okay, this is a moment of editorial judgment. Like you could say it's expressing a point of view, or you could say it's just reporting the news. The news is that he announced this, and then not many people were listening, in person at least. And then they cut back to Cronkite. And Cronkite said, you've seen Lester Maddox declaring he's no longer running for president, a candidacy which no one really took seriously except for Maddox himself. This was uncharacteristically snarky for Cronkite, who, avoided snark. And he's snarky a few other interesting times I might talk about later. At the convention. And I thought, okay, he's making an editorial judgment. He's the fair guy, the neutral guy, the balanced guy. But the objective truth is that this guy was kind of a clown as a candidate for president. No one took it seriously. And so this was a fair evaluation. So it got me thinking about that era and what news objectivity meant, what neutrality was, what it meant to be fair. And then, having watched the Maddox footage, I was like, well, I came to New York City to look at Maddox footage. There's a lot less than I thought there would be at the Paley Center. I think I'll watch the Democratic Convention from start to finish, because they had the CBS material there, and I realized no one had actually rewatched this stuff since August of 1968. Everyone's talked about it. It's a big reference point. This is a really important moment in American history. Media historians point to it as really important, and I realized no one actually dug into it. So this was my big chance to dig into it. So I wrote a piece for Politico, it was 2018, so it was a kind of, the news hook was, it's the 50th anniversary. And that was just drawing on the CBS footage. And then later I would go on to look at the NBC footage as well. ABC is a much smaller player in all of this. It's a whole little separate mini story. But I was so excited with the political essay and realized that there's an interest from a larger audience in this based on that I thought, I'm going to just expand this out and do a whole book on it. So that's That's the origin story.
I love that. It's always fascinating to hear what the first entry point is for what turns into books. And I mean, since we're on this subject of the media, and since I have the opportunity to pick the brain of a media scholar, which is not a position I'm usually in, um, I'm wondering like if we could do a little bit of comparative work. I mean, so the story that you tell here and Chicago 68 unfolds within a media landscape that is like fundamentally different than the one that we currently live in. I mean, and I'm like, you know, I'm apparently classified as an elder millennial, but so I don't have a particular memory of a media landscape that is how you describe it in, and so um, I guess like at a few different points in the book, you caution your readers against being nostalgic for this golden era of network news. But I'm wondering if it would be wrong to frame it as at least marginally better than what we currently have. Um, I don't know if you care to weigh in on this, like the benefits of that era's network coverage, which was largely and by design intended towards fairness, intended towards balance, and very much directed not at the extremes, but at the center of American politics. Um, and I'm just wondering if you have thoughts, which I'm sure you do, about how people received news at that point versus this sort of infinitely more diffuse and siloed new media world that we live in now.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't marginally better. It was much better in many ways. And, I opened the book with the line, Americans are bad at history, but good at nostalgia. And you're right that throughout, I'm like, I'm cautious, like it's tempting to be nostalgic for this, but let's keep in mind, I sort of temper it because the newsmen, mostly men, but there's some women, but mostly men in Chicago, they made mistakes, and I point to those mistakes. But their intentions were good. They weren't trying to get in feuds and all the kind of stuff we see today. They weren't trying to best the other guy in the ratings, for sure. Um, there's that old saying, like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And I feel like you could say just because you're nostalgic doesn't mean that things weren't better. Like you have to be critical, but you can also realize, like, yeah, there was a lot that was better to that scene at the time. A key moment in the book that I think illustrates the the peril of that sort of nostalgia and when you've sort of got it wrong is an interview that Walter Cronkite does with Mayor Daley. And I'm going to unfold that story for you in its entirety. So the Battle of Michigan Avenue happens late at night, and the networks are deluged with telegrams and phone calls all night. I teach this to my undergrads. I'm like, okay, what's a telegram? It's like a text, but with paper too, like and it comes really fast, but not as fast, but pretty fast. So they're getting telegrams all night, and I've read through them, and a lot of them are just generically in despair. Like, what the hell is happening to America? It's like a tipping point moment for them in the despair after, 68 was a hard year of assassinations, of urban uprisings, right? Um, and a lot of the phone calls are also just that kind of general despair. A lot of them are very negative, and they're like, how dare you show the police this way? Don't you realize that people provoke them and they deserve to be beaten? And that's a line that Daley amplified afterwards, and as did Nixon. And then it took root, and it stuck as a story. So the networks reached out to Daley the next day. We've got all this negative mail. We have to be fair, or negative telegrams and phone calls. We have to be fair. Let's have him in. Let's invite him. He accepts Cronkite's invitation. He shows up on the set, and it's right before the New Day broadcast starts. And he says, I was invited, and my wife and I welcome you into our home every night. And Mrs. Daley thought I should come be on the show. And he was like, oh, thank you, sir. Now, Cronkite was already known as not a very strong interviewer. That was his Achilles heel. He wasn't great. And he didn't prepare very much for this interview because he assumed that Daley would shoot himself in the foot, because Daley was not great with words. He was prone to malapropisms, right? After, he said at one point, like, the police is not here to oh God, I'm going to get this one wrong now. To prevent disorder, the police is here to preserve disorder. That's it. Not to prevent, but to preserve disorder. You know, and so Cronkite assumed like that's how he's going to talk. It's going to be an easy interview. And Daley shows up with a pre-written press release by his press secretary and says, if you don't mind, Walter, I really would like to read this. And Cronkite's like, okay. And he just goes off for, maybe 10 minutes. The whole interview is maybe 14 or 15 minutes, but the whole 10 minutes is him reading from this script. It's full of misinformation, disinformation, and there's no questioning it. He just keeps reading and reading and reading. And then Cronkite follows up with really softball questions. The mayor is just walking all over him. He even gets in a few digs at New York City and at Mayor Lindsay, and because he hated Mayor Lindsay. Lindsay was Kennedy-esque. He was handsome. He was well-spoken. Daley was not handsome and well-spoken, so it was like, yeah. And he didn't respect him. I mean, a garbage strike. There were piles of garbage on TV every night showing New York City, and it became a metaphor for the American crisis in '68. So Cronkite does this very poor interview, and he acknowledged it was a low point of his career, as did everyone else. There was no sugarcoating it. And at the end, Cronkite closes out by saying, well, I don't envy the mayor of any large city in America right now, acknowledging the crisis all over. But I was speaking with my coworkers before the unpleasantness began. Unpleasantness, meaning people being beaten in the streets, right? Which, I mean, there was no before. They were constantly being beaten, even before the convention started. And we just agreed that the Chicago police are just the nicest, most cordial, polite, and helpful police we'd ever met. And then he said, and I don't think we'll see eye to eye on everything about all of this. And then Daley says, no, we won't see eye to eye, but that doesn't mean we can't be friends. And they shook hands, and that was the end. And I thought, well, they will never be friends. These guys are not friends. And it points to the problems in that nostalgia we have for this era, that in the name of fairness and cordiality and, well, we've been attacked, so we have to let him express his point of view, he had done poor news. He'd done poor reporting. He'd done a poor interview. And if he had not been so fair and cordial, he would have gotten, I don't know if he would have gotten a good interview out of Daley, but it would have done a better service to his viewers. So it points to that the problems of being too nostalgic about what fairness might have meant in the past.
Yeah, totally. So I have a lot of things. When you were just speaking, I was thinking about a number of different things related to '68 being such an important year for policing too in this country, which I'll follow up with if we have time. But kind of circling back to what has and hasn't been written about the DNC, and one of the things that I think really distinguishes when the news broke from other writings about Chicago '68 is you really center like white supremacy as an important aspect of floor discussions that were taking place at the convention, right? And this event has been canonized as being about the counterculture, as being about Vietnam. But so I'm wondering if I think it's a really important point that you're re-injecting civil rights and re-injecting white supremacy in the battles in favor of its preservation and against it within the book. And I'm wondering if you could just tell people a little bit about why that's important. Tell people a little bit about those battles and about why you think they're important to this story.
It's so important. So in 1964, as I referenced, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party comes to I guess it was Atlantic City where the DNC met, and they try to get their Mississippi delegates seated instead of the all-white delegation. And they fail, and the DNC says, well, in '68, you'll be seated. Come back. And so they come back in '68, and they are seated. But there are, I believe, 17 other delegate challenges from 16 states. I think that's the number. 2 from Alabama alone. And they're all defeated. And Georgia has a sort of 50-50 kind of victory, like where the Georgia delegates are seated, the black challengers are seated with the so-called regulars, the ones that Maddox picked, right? And they each get half a vote. So it's it's not, there's some things better than in 64, like the Mississippi delegation being seated. But it doesn't get the traction in the media as like being about racial issues. Even though LBJ famously kind of cut off Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony and did a live news show to interrupt her and stuff, but still, the memory was that this was about racial issues. And so if you really dig deep into what happened at the convention in 68, it was about race issues, but the networks often treat it as a procedural problem. Like, well, we're voting on this and we're being held up while they do a head count vote and this kind of stuff. I'm like, it's a procedural problem about whether people in Alabama who are black should be able to vote. Like it's not procedural. So they taught it, sometimes treat it like a Robert's Rules of Order kind of thing. And the thing is, they did know better. I've read their briefing books. I've seen the information they had going in. And I don't think it was strictly because they didn't think that the racial issues were important. I think they thought a lot of them were too complicated. You would really get in the weeds procedurally, and they were probably thinking of an average viewer who would be like, "This is too complicated for them," which is a problem. There were racial undercurrents there, but I don't think that they saw that way. So it's a really important part of the story that I added back in. In the streets, it's remembered as you noted, like it's a countercultural thing. It's a very white crowd of hippies and yippies, some SDS members, just a big mix, the mobilization to stop the war. Well, the local black protesters and activists, for the most part, saw this as a white event, and many of them, if they could, they fled town. If they couldn't flee, they hid, because they knew that Daley's people would come and round them up, like in Casablanca, the usual suspects would round them up and take them away before the convention even started. Now, the context for that is not just police harassment in Chicago, but also specifically that after the Martin Luther King's assassination in April, of course, there's about 110 uprisings throughout the country, and one of them is in Chicago, and people are killed, buildings are burned down. It is chaos, crisis, and everyone assumed that Chicago was the one city that wouldn't have so-called race riots. And then after the King assassination, of course they'd had them in the past, but after the King assassination, all hell broke loose. Daley assumed these protesters are going to come and there's going to be another race riot. That was his thinking. And that's why he's putting barbed wire around the amphitheater, sealing the manhole covers with tar so that no one could be under there. With a bomb. He believes the yippies, apparently, when they say they're going to get everyone high on acid, they're going to put LSD in the water supply. It would have taken 2 tons of LSD to dope everyone, get everyone high in Chicago, but he believed it, right? And this was all going to play into this race riot that he thought was going to happen, so he's really clamping down. So the excessive security, and just to bring this point home, excessive security is not just that police beat people a lot. You had 10,000 police officers on 24-hour shifts, a constant rotation of shifts. You had, I think it was 12,000 National Guards. You had 1,000 Secret Service, including agent provocateur in the crowd, people stirring things up. So that comes out to almost, I'm losing the math. 23, thank you, and 10,000 protesters. 2 to 1. Okay, so it's a tinderbox, and it ends up being a tinderbox of white-on-white violence. But it was assumed beforehand that it was going to be a tinderbox of white-on-black violence or black-on-white violence, and so that's crucial context for understanding what actually happened.
I actually want to follow up on that by staying in this comparison of what happens here in April of '68 in the wake of MLK's assassination versus what happens in August. And so one of the chapters of my own book, I look at these two events sort of side by side, because what happens in April is just absolutely gutting police violence against black people on the West Side. Nearly a dozen people are killed. Several of them are killed very much execution style by the police. And so one of the things that I argue in my book is that, like, why is it that it's not even so much an argument, it's an argument framed as a question.
But why is it that when people think about police violence in Chicago in '68, they think about what happened, at the Battle of Michigan Avenue, all around the streets of downtown? Why is it that people think of that as the very sort of iconic visual of police excess, when actually you could compare it with what police did to black people on the West Side, what the police did to black people every day, and actually frame what happened at the DNC as profound restraint from a comparative perspective. And so it was actually really illuminating for me to read your book. I wish that it had been written before. I wish it was out before my book was done, because I think that this is perhaps me speculating a bit, but I think that in part the reason why '68, when cops beat but don't kill a majority white crowd, people remember that and they don't really remember the West Side uprising and the police response. I sort of just said, well, it's just about the race of the victims. But I think it's also, and these two things are not unrelated, but it's also a product of the way that media covered these various events. And so I'm wondering, your book I think was really helpful in clarifying that for me. And I don't know if you'd like to speak some more about that.
Yeah, there's one book about Chicago that came out initially in '69 that was republished by University of Chicago Press years later, called Nobody Was Killed, and that's written from a very kind of left perspective. The point is, yeah, nobody's killed, but wow, this was terrible, and he goes right into it. And then there's another book, Battleground Chicago, which is the one I mentioned earlier, I believe I have the title right, which is from the police perspective. And they say exactly what you said, like, oh yeah, everyone said we were so violent. We didn't kill anyone. We could have killed lots of people. It's a horrifying book to read, and they're not being flippant about it. They're like, if it was so bad, how come we didn't kill anyone? We held back, and that violence was kind of expected. Daley was showing that he could control his city through this violence, and the read ultimately was like, oh, this is showing a city out of control. But they thought they were doing exactly what he expected of them, showing that they had maintained control. So the horror of these images that have been for viewers, the horror of these frozen images of white on white violence, like the picture I showed you earlier, was from a lot of people who had become used to seeing white on black violence during these urban uprisings, and sort of saw that from a Nixonian perspective of like, well, that's law and order, and then they see white on white violence, and they're like, well, I hate these protesters, but now what? I mean, it would seem like a bridge too far from a certain perspective of a white supremacist perspective. So that's part of what's going on. But you're asking also, like, well, how much is the news to blame for this? How they framed things, how they showed things, for how these memories were crafted. And one of the great ways to answer that is to look at the example from the book about the Republican convention in Miami. And I would encourage everyone to read Miami and the Siege of Chicago by Norman Mailer, which in some ways was an inspiration for my book. And he starts with Miami and then he does Chicago. But in Miami, the line was like, well, this was a very stage managed convention. Obviously, Nixon was going to be nominated. Everything went great, yada, yada. And it was, I mean, Huntley and Brinkley were being effusive about the whipped cream at the receptions and so much. How many pounds of fresh shrimp did they bring in? It's like the softest kind of reporting. They're just like giddy, about the canapes. And during the Republican convention in Miami, there was an uprising in a town called Liberty City, and 3 black people were killed after 2 days of fighting in the streets. And those tear gas wagons that are an image so much of 1968, these sort of, and you probably know these better than I do, they're like trucks with kind of, I think they might have hoses coming out of them. They're sanitation trucks, I think, repurposed for spraying people with tear gas. And that uprising was a voting rally to which Ralph Abernathy and Wilt Chamberlain, who were both in town for the RNC, were invited to, and they didn't show up. And then some guy drove through the middle of the rally with a Wallace for President bumper sticker on his car. And then the rally said, we want media coverage for this, but only black reporters can cover it. And a white reporter showed up, and there was some conflict around that. And and then the sheriff said of the county said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. This story was retold when the former President Trump said similar words during the BLM protests following the murder of George Floyd. So that's a chilling moment. And the news cameras didn't cut away and say, we have this riot related to what's happening at the convention. They saw it as unrelated. It was a few miles away. Of course, that was true in Chicago. There's a huge distance between where the protesters were and where the amphitheater was. They weren't allowed to get near it. They weren't allowed to march. It was seen as unrelated, but clearly they were doing this during the convention. They were inviting two people who were very high profile at the convention. Chamberlain, because he was a Nixon supporter and he was his most visible black supporter. He didn't have a lot of black supporters. And Abernathy was at both conventions, and he's there as the king kind of representative. And so clearly it was relevant, but they just didn't see it that way. They just didn't go cover it that way. And so the takeaway was like everything went fine in Miami. And when Daley didn't like the coverage in Chicago, he said, you're not covering us fairly. And look what happened in Miami. 3 people died. Nobody died here. And we're like, well, we're not going to change our coverage based on what we might have done wrong in Miami. Like, it wasn't really logical. But he wasn't wrong. Like, they were showing things in Chicago that they had not shown in Miami. So it's a really important part to add back into the story, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I found it totally revelatory. So we're almost out of time for Heather and I to talk, but I'm just gonna offer one last question that I think actually does follow up with. It's again thinking about doing this type of work of history in the present. I mean, so you allude on numerous occasions to new media, to the Trump era. I don't think you name him as such, but at times Richard Daley comes across as a sort of less cartoonishly incurious and stupid version, or a stupid version of Donald Trump. But as Trumpish in his gaslighting, in his overt disdain for the media, his obsession with the projection of power, with his obsession with control over perceived inferiors, his insistence on personal brand, ultimately at the cost of his party, and so on and so forth. And you start your acknowledgments, literally the first sentence of the acknowledgments, by noting that you wrote this book about elections and political gaslighting and police violence and hostility towards the media and so on at a quote unquote particularly difficult time. And so can I ask you to reflect on that experience and how you see this history as offering helpful, if perhaps not hopeful, insights onto the present American crisis?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you. First of all, like there's a Trump Daley comparison. I do talk about Trump overtly in the conclusion. That comparison is useful and interesting in certain ways. The kind of authoritarian drive and the attacks on the media, and a certain ego and so on, right? So there are some interesting parallels, and then tremendously huge differences beyond the fact that they are 50 years apart, and that we don't want to be too presentist about the whole thing. But and some of them are just personal. Daley's a devout Catholic, and Trump is not religiously devout, even though he courts that audience and so on. But also, Trump doesn't hate the media. Trump loves the media. He loves to play the media, and he knows how to do it. And one of the fascinating things about Daley is that he hated the media, but he didn't need the media. He was part of he led this machine. And what they did at election time, and what I mean by he didn't need it, is that when they had elections, they didn't have to spend millions and millions of dollars on TV ads and radio ads and stuff like that. They ran some TV spots, they ran some radio spots. He was very good with place-based advertising, billboards, movie theater marquees, signs in people's shops. Because if you went into a tamale shop and said, put up this sign for Daley, even if the person didn't like Daley, they would put it up, because if they didn't, the health inspector would be there in a few hours. I mean, I'm not exaggerating at all, right? Read Mike Royko's book, Boss. It's all there, right? So he needed the media to just promote that there was an election and to get people to vote. He wanted people to vote. But he and his party had already selected the slate of Democrats who would win. And of course, there's all kinds of voter fishy stuff of like walking into a voting booth with someone who's voting. They called it four-legged voting. So you're in there voting and someone just walks in and you're like, excuse me. And they're like, you're voting Democrat, right? Okay. And then the poll worker might push the lever, I'm not kidding, like 40, 50 times more. And poll watchers who, if they were looking for honesty here, or sometimes if they were a Republican, are like, wait a minute, would be beaten up and then be arrested for disorderly conduct. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on. So he doesn't need media to convince you of who's the better person to vote for, right? So that's like a key difference from Trump, who is just like, you know, playing the media and using CNN for free publicity and this kind of stuff. Okay, so just to back up to one other part of your question about the acknowledgments and saying I wrote this during a very difficult time, I'll just say, you know, personally, like I'm writing this book in California, I'm on a fellowship, I'm away from home, suddenly there's lockdown, there's coronavirus, we're all terrified. It feels very apocalyptic. Then there's the Floyd murder and the BLM protests, and things are getting more and more apocalyptic, more and more off the rails. And I'm spending all day watching police brutality on my computer, thinking about it, and then stopping to watch police brutality and think about it in real life and listen to the radio because well, anyway, it was very difficult. And so it might have helped make it a better book. It might, you know, and I survived, but it was rough. But it might have got me in this certain kind of apocalyptic mindset that was useful. And finally, just a third point about thinking about Trump and the president in the past is around thinking about the ways people react to news who attack it for being too liberal or fake or whatever. And the way that I like to explain it is that in '68, when people attacked the networks and basically scapegoated them, like, we don't like what we're seeing, so it's your fault, right? What they were basically arguing was, you've got a camera in your hands and you're shooting, let's just say that you guys are in Michigan Avenue, right? And I've got a camera and I'm kind of going like this and police are hitting you, right? But if I had turned my camera like this and like this and like this, I would have seen more. I would have had more footage. I could have told a better story. So the point was, you told the story wrong. You didn't show the provocation. You didn't show the violence from the protesters, just the violence to the protesters. But if you'd taken more footage and done better storytelling, you would have done a good job. That's very different from saying, I saw these images and I know that they're fake. It never happened. You made it up. It's phony. And of course, sometimes, like, we do have deep fakes now. We do have the capability for artificial imagery in a way that we didn't have then. But it's a kind of ontological shift in your perception of the world to just be like, it's not that the story was wrong, it's that it never happened. And so that points to that gaslighting was the word that you used.
All right, thank you both. I'm going to answer or ask some questions. You can answer them. I apologize for our flashing blue screen. Has nothing to do with the police at all. We're just having some technical difficulties. So I just want to remind everyone, both in the room and at home, if you have a question you'd like to ask, the number you can text is 833-899-3399. And we do have some questions that have come in, maybe not surprisingly, a few about objectivity in the news. And someone asks, do you feel that objectivity is not actually objective, but instead treating both sides as equally legitimate pushes the Overton window further either left or right? And what do you feel the implications of that may be?
I use the word objectivity a little bit as a kind of shorthand, but in '68, the networks were very aware that there's no such thing as objectivity. They thought about it. You can see interoffice memos about it. If you go to the archive, it's really on their mind. They're like, no one can be objective. And even though they weren't super aware, we're white middle class men, and that wasn't always on their mind. They were a little aware of that. They did talk about like how their upbringing, how their positioning impacted the news. And so their objective was not to be objective, but to be fair. And sometimes fairness meant not showing both sides because one side was patently correct in certain ways. And maybe that was a judgment, but like the way that they covered civil rights, they saw that as a kind of golden age for themselves. And they made mistakes during civil rights too. And they did show segregationists and so on, but they weren't always like, okay, we had the head of the NAACP, now let's have the head of the Klan on the show, which would be the equivalent of today of like having Richard Spencer on after you have someone, you know, on a liberal side. So they were thoughtful about this, but kind of I'm trying to figure out the best way to explain it. One thing I say in the book is that it took the contemporary news media 4 years to figure out that their both sidesism with Trump was a disaster, that they were doing the wrong thing. And at one point I say it took CBS News 3 days. Okay, so they made mistakes. But 3 days in, they realized when they saw the Battle of Michigan Avenue, they knew what they were seeing. And they were like, it would be fine if the police were willing to comment, but they're actually not. And we don't have to turn to the police because we've seen them in action. And there's a moment where Cronkite, late at night, CBS has already signed, or NBC has signed off, and CBS stays on, and Cronkite's just gotten some 16mm footage that they just got developed from 5 or 6 hours earlier in the day. And it's unusual. They always have a voiceover explaining what you're seeing, and it's kind of holding your hand through footage. And they say, and he says, all right, this footage, we just shot it today. He names the cinematographer, which is very unusual on TV news, because he thought he was so brave for doing this. This guy, Dick Perez, who had been in Mississippi with Dan Rather years earlier. It was really good. He said, Dick Perez did this. It was very brave. There's no voiceover. We're just going to show it to you. The images speak for themselves. And it was a woman in a station wagon trying to rescue some kids, some protesters who are being tear gassed, and the National Guard is pointing bayonets at the wheels of her car so that she can't move, and then they put a grenade launcher through the window of her car next to her head, about 3 inches from her head. And that's the only time that Cronkite interrupts, because he just says that's a grenade launcher, because he thinks you might not know what, you know, you might think it's just a gun, not a grenade being pointed at her head. And then at the end he says, well, that's what happened. And he sort of ended the broadcast day. He signed off with some other stuff, but he didn't comment on the images. And so, you know, in a way, if you were a philosopher of imagery, you would say, like, images can't just be ontologically true. We have to complicate that as a philosopher. Well, you know, but there's a sort of belief that there's a kind of objectivity that's there that doesn't require the other side, you know. So I think that the book and my research is helpful for just kind of thinking through this both sidesism issue and how we can push and prod differently at the both sidesism issue today, looking back at the past and how they handled these issues.
So you, according to this question, you say several times in your book that the protests on the street and in the parks were a somewhat undertold story during the week of the convention. However, in our memories of 68, the story that's always told is the story of the violence that we saw. Why the reversal, and why the reason for the shift?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. So, because there was a loss, the FCC did an investigation which found that the news had done a very fine job and they weren't punished or anything. And this was based on citizen complaint letters. And because the FCC was doing this brief investigation that didn't end up punishing anyone, right? But they go to NBC, and NBC examines all their footage and does rigorous content analysis and finds that 3% of their coverage showed violence in 4 days. And the president of NBC News, Reuben Frank, says, okay, it was 3%. CBS, it seems to be more like 5%. Okay, so 95 to 97% is inside the convention hall. So why do we remember it the other way? Well, in part because these images in contemporary parlance went viral. They were amplified. They showed up, still photos showed up in newspapers and in magazines in the days and weeks following the convention. The footage was replayed on TV news across the country. So part of it was that amplification, and part of it was, you know, this seemed like the most important and interesting thing to remember, because people weren't paying attention to all the interesting and important things that were happening inside the convention hall, like the Julian Bond story and so on. So in a way, it's people responding to what they are seeing over and over again, and in a way, it's also sort of getting it wrong, both the viewers and also the networks, and not. But the networks were sort of painted into a corner. No matter how much they said, look, the empirical reality is that we didn't show that much violence. People were like, you showed too much. And one of my critiques in the book is that they didn't show enough violence because they really held back. They thought it was fair not to cover too much violence. And so it was happening constantly, and they underplayed it. And I've got this one section called Interlude and Afternoon of Tear Gas, where I look at one of the first moments where they really show the violence, and it's all overhead, part of it's overhead shots of people being tear gassed, and Aileen Saarinen, who's one of the very few women who gets airtime during the whole thing, is in voiceover explaining what you're seeing. These are people moving away from the tear gas. This is the person lobbing the tear gas. This is what you're seeing. That kind of voiceover that Cronkite was talking about, how we usually have that over images. And as she's narrating, we never see her face, she's starting to choke and suffer from tear gas. And you hear someone muttering, and I had to play the footage over and over again, like, put this wet cloth over your face, try not to breathe too much. And she's saying, one doesn't like this tear gas in his nose. She's reverting to grammar, you know, of like the first person to kind of get through it in this weird way, right? It's just such a troubling moment that in a way you're not misremembering if you think that you saw too much violence, because those moments are so strong, and they're so much stronger than some of the shots of, you know, delegates on the floor shouting at each other with microphones.
Thanks. So we just have a couple more minutes. So there's a fairly interesting yet simple question in here, and I'm gonna ask it of both of you. And that is, where do you get your news? Where do you think is a good place at this time in history to get information about what's happening in the world?
I miss Judy Woodruff. When she went off the air, I was like, I guess I'm kind of a niche nerd demographic, and I looked it up, and it said the average age of a viewer of Judy Woodruff was 68. Like, wow, okay, that's not me. But geez, there are still people in mainstream news media who are trying to kind of hold up the banner of what good professional integrity would be in journalism on the networks. You know, people like John Dickerson, whose mother, Nancy Dickerson, is featured in my book. And I try to avoid the pundits and the shouters and the opinion stuff that isn't actually news. There's a lot of opinion on TV instead of news on TV. So I keep up with what's happening on heavily left, right, whatever, shouting match kind of TV. So I know what's going on because that's my research area. But I don't feel like I'm getting news from that. And I'll just add one other thing, is that I used to voraciously watch The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. I still watch, what do you call it? I now watch the Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which is very, you know, one-sided compared to Colbert and The Daily Show. But I often think that if news is going to be subject to ratings as it has been in the past, but like it's suffering for low numbers, and people are arguing more and being more rhetorically violent to get their numbers up. If there's a better way to keep numbers up, it's through comedy. Because some of the comic news that some purists denigrate is actually the best news. If you go back and look at Jon Stewart interviewing Bill Kristol, it is smart. It has a sense of humor, right? And you know, they're doing these short interviews, and then Jon Stewart says, "Okay, we have the full interview online. Just go watch the whole thing if you want to." So I think that the one strategy for dealing with the crisis of all the punditry and the shouting is a redirect to, like, okay, this is also going to get you high ratings. This is also very entertaining, but it's also very smart. Is to look at some of the comedy approaches to doing smart news.
Okay, well, we'll let Heather close it there. Let's once more express our gratitude to Heather and Simon for tonight's talk.